Have you ever looked at someone and thought you knew their entire story? Have you ever judged a person by the trembling in their hands, the grey in their hair, or the worn-out clothes on their back? What if I told you that the frail old man standing in line at a gas station, ignored and dismissed by everyone around him, once carried the weight of missions so dangerous that even their names remain classified? What if that quiet, unassuming figure you walked past without a second glance had stared death in the face more times than you've taken breaths today? This is the story of Frank Delaney. And before this day ends, a group of arrogant young men will learn a lesson they'll never forget. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September, the kind of day where the heat clings to your skin even as the sun begins its slow descent toward the horizon. The gas station sat on the edge of town, a relic from another era with peeling paint, flickering neon signs, and pumps that groaned with every gallon dispensed. It wasn't the kind of place people visited by choice. It was a place you stopped at out of necessity, a pit stop between where you were and where you needed to be. The asphalt was cracked and stained with decades of oil and neglect. A single security camera hung loosely from the corner of the building, its lens so dirty it might as well have been blind. Frank Delaney's pickup truck rattled as it pulled into the lot, the engine coughing like an old man clearing his throat. The truck was forest green once, maybe 30 years ago, but now it was a patchwork of rust and faded paint, held together by stubbornness and duct tape. Frank turned off the ignition and sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. His fingers were gnarled, the knuckles swollen from arthritis that never quite let him forget the cold waters of the North Atlantic or the scorching deserts where he'd once fought. He took a slow breath, the kind that comes with age and too many memories, then reached for the door handle. The door creaked open, protesting with every inch, and Frank stepped out into the dying light of the afternoon. He was 73 years old, though he looked older. His back was slightly bent, not from weakness, but from the weight of years spent carrying gear, wounded brothers, and secrets too heavy for most men to bear. He wore faded blue jeans that had been washed so many times the denim was soft as cloth, a plain grey t-shirt, and a baseball cap with the words U.S. Navy Veteran embroidered across the front in gold thread that had started to fray. His face was weathered, lined with deep creases that mapped out a life lived hard and without apology. His eyes were different. They were the color of steel on a cloudy day, and if you looked closely, really looked, you'd see something in them that didn't match the frail body they inhabited. You'd see the kind of sharpness that doesn't dull with age. But nobody looked closely. Not today. Frank closed the truck door and began his slow walk toward the convenience store attached to the gas station. Each step was deliberate, careful, as if his legs were negotiating with his body about whether they'd hold him up for another mile. His right knee clicked with every other step, a souvenir from a parachute jump gone wrong somewhere over Afghanistan in 1989. He didn't use a cane, though his doctor had suggested it more than once. Frank Delaney didn't do canes. As he approached the entrance, he noticed them. It was hard not to. 3 cars were parked haphazardly near the pumps, blocking 2 lanes like they owned the place. The cars were new, expensive, the kind with custom rims that probably cost more than Frank's entire truck. One was a black Dodge Charger with tinted windows, so dark they seemed to swallow light. Another was a metallic blue BMW with an aftermarket exhaust that rumbled even when idle. The third was a cherry red Mustang with racing stripes and a spoiler that looked like it belonged on an airplane. Leaning against these machines were 5 young men, all in their early 20s, dressed in oversized jerseys, baggy jeans that hung low enough to show their designer boxers, and enough gold chains to fund a small country. They were loud, the kind of loud that demands attention, that insists the world revolve around them. Their laughter echoed across the parking lot, sharp and mocking, the kind of laughter that's never really about joy. The one in the middle, the tallest and loudest of them all, was named Trey. He had an angular face, with a jawline he probably spent too much time admiring in the mirror, dark eyes that gleamed with arrogance, and a smile that never quite reached those eyes. His hair was cut into a fade so sharp you could use it as a ruler, and a diamond stud glinted in his left ear. He wore a Los Angeles Lakers jersey with the number 23, and his sneakers were blindingly white, the kind that had never seen a day of actual work. Trey was the kind of man who thought respect was something you took, not something you earned. As Frank shuffled past them toward the door, Trey's eyes locked onto him. There was a moment, just a brief flicker of calculation, where Trey sized up the old man and decided he'd found his entertainment for the afternoon. He nudged the guy next to him, a shorter, stockier kid named Marcus, who had a tattoo of a snake coiling up his neck, and jerked his chin toward Frank. "Yo, check out Grandpa over here," Trey said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Man looks like he about to fall over and die right here at the pump." The others turned, their attention shifting like predators noticing wounded prey. They laughed, a chorus of cruel amusement that seemed to feed off itself, growing louder with each echo. Frank heard them. Of course he heard them. But he didn't turn around. He'd heard worse. He'd been called worse by men far more dangerous than these kids playing dress-up in their expensive cars. He reached for the door handle of the convenience store. "Aye, old man," Trey called out, pushing off from the charger and taking a few steps toward Frank. "Where you think you going? You hear me talking to you?" Frank paused. His hand was on the door handle, but he didn't pull it open. Not yet. He stood there perfectly still, his back to them. Inside his chest, his heart beat with the same steady rhythm it had maintained through firefights, extractions, and missions where silence meant the difference between life and death. He knew what was coming. Men like Trey, they needed an audience, needed validation. And right now, Frank was the only show in town. Slowly, deliberately, Frank turned around. He didn't say a word. He just looked at them, his steel-grey eyes moving from one face to another, cataloguing, assessing, the way he'd been trained to do decades ago. Trey's smile widened. He thought the old man was scared. He thought that silence was submission. "Oh, so now you want to pay attention?" Trey laughed, and his crew laughed with him. "What's wrong, old-timer? Hearing aid broke? Or you just too old to remember how to talk?" Marcus stepped forward, emboldened by Trey's performance. "Man, look at him shaking. Probably got that, what they call it, Parkinson's?" He made an exaggerated trembling motion with his hands, and the group erupted in laughter. Frank's hands weren't shaking. They never shook. Not when he was holding a rifle, not when he was defusing explosives, not when he was making life or death decisions in the space of a heartbeat. But these kids, they saw what they wanted to see. Inside the convenience store, a young woman named Sarah stood behind the register, her eyes wide as she watched the scene unfold through the grimy window. She was 19, working her way through community college, and she'd seen Trey and his crew come through here before. They never paid for everything they took. They'd make a mess, intimidate customers, and leave like they owned the place. She wanted to call the police, but her manager had told her not to. "Not worth the trouble," he'd said. "Just let them do their thing and they'll leave." Another customer, an older black man named Jerome, who'd stopped to buy cigarettes, stood frozen near the beer cooler. He recognized that look in Trey's eyes. He'd seen it before, growing up in neighborhoods where young men like that ruled the streets through fear and posturing. Jerome's hand tightened around his wallet. He wanted to help, wanted to say something, but fear held him in place. What could one man do against five? Outside, Trey was getting bolder. He walked right up to Frank, close enough that the old man could smell the cologne that was trying way too hard, could see the gold cap on one of Trey's front teeth. "You deaf or something, old man?" Trey said, his voice dropping to something more menacing. "I asked you a question. Where you think you going?" Frank's expression didn't change. He stood there, his posture somehow straighter now despite his age, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, with the kind of calm that only comes from a man who has nothing left to prove. "I'm going inside to pay for gas," Frank said simply. then I'm going home." It was such a mundane answer, so matter-of-fact, that for a second Trey didn't know how to respond. But then Marcus laughed, breaking the tension, and Trey's ego demanded he escalate. "Oh, you going inside?" Trey mocked. "You got money, old man? Or you gonna pay with food stamps and whatever change you got rattling around in those dusty pockets?" One of the other guys, a lanky kid with acne scars named Devon, suddenly reached out and snatched the cap off Frank's head. The movement was quick, disrespectful, the kind of violation that's designed to humiliate. "Yo, what's this?" Devon said, holding up the cap and reading the embroidery out loud in an exaggerated, mocking voice. "U.S. Navy veteran." He looked at his friends and laughed. "Man, this dude probably swabbed decks or some shit, probably peeled potatoes his whole career." The group howled with laughter. Trey snatched the cap from Devon and examined it like it was a piece of garbage. "Navy, huh?" Trey said, turning the cap over in his hands. "What you do in the Navy, old man? Sit on a boat and get seasick?" He held the cap out toward Frank but pulled it back when Frank reached for it, a childish keep-away game that drew more laughter from his crew. Sarah, inside the store, felt her stomach turn. She grabbed her phone, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button, but she hesitated. What would she even say? That some kids were being mean to an old man? Would the cops even come for that? Frank stood perfectly still. His eyes never left Trey's face. There was no anger there, no fear, no pleading. Just that same steel-gray calm, like he was looking at something very far away, or maybe something deep inside himself. "Give me back my hat," Frank said quietly. "Or what?" Trey shot back, stepping even closer, invading Frank's space completely. "What you gonna do, old man? You gonna fight me? You can barely stand up straight." Marcus moved to Frank's left, Devon to his right. They were surrounding him now, a pack circling what they thought was easy prey. Another member of the crew, a heavy-set kid named Jamal, pulled out his phone and started recording, grinning as he captured what he thought would be viral content. "Yo, this is about to be comedy," Jamal said, narrating for his future audience. "We got this old dude out here fronting like he tough." Trey held the cap above his head, taunting Frank like a bully on a playground. "Come on, Grandpa, jump for it. Let's see if those old bones still work." Frank didn't jump, he didn't lunge, he didn't plead. He simply stood there, and for the first time since this confrontation began, a slight smile touched the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was something else entirely. Something that, if Trey had been paying attention, might have warned him that he'd made a terrible miscalculation. But Trey wasn't paying attention. None of them were. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the gas station parking lot. The security camera continued its lazy swing back and forth, recording everything and nothing. Inside the store, Sarah finally pressed the emergency call button, her hand shaking. Jerome set down his cigarettes and moved toward the door, something in his gut telling him that what was about to happen would change everything. And Frank Delaney, decorated Navy SEAL, veteran of wars that would never make the evening news, survivor of missions that remain classified to this day, stood in that parking lot and made a decision. But what these young men didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that respect isn't given freely, and some men, no matter how old they get, never forget the lessons learned in the darkness where heroes are made. The air in the parking lot felt heavier now, like the atmosphere before a storm breaks. Frank stood motionless as Trey continued to wave his cap in the air like a trophy, each taunt growing bolder, each laugh from the crew cutting deeper into the fabric of common decency. But if you had known Frank Delaney, really known him, you'd understand that this moment wasn't about a hat. It was never about a hat. It was about every time someone had looked at him in the past decade and seen only what age had taken, never what time had given. It was about invisible wounds that don't show up on X-rays. It was about brothers who never came home, about missions accomplished in silence and sacrifice forgotten in noise. It was about a nation that pins medals on your chest when you're young and strong, then looks away when you're old and weathered. Frank's mind flickered, just for a moment, to another time, another place. 1991, the Persian Gulf, Operation Desert Storm. The night was so dark it felt like being swallowed by the ocean itself. Frank was 40 years old then, in his prime, leading a 6-man SEAL team on a covert infiltration mission behind enemy lines. Their objective was simple in theory, impossible in practice: extract a downed pilot being held in a makeshift prison camp 15 miles inland from the coast. Intel suggested the pilot had information that couldn't fall into enemy hands. Failure wasn't an option. Neither was getting caught. Frank remembered the weight of the water as they emerged from the submarine, the cold Persian Gulf washing over them as they began their swim to shore. He remembered the silence of his team, each man focused, trained, trusting. He remembered reaching the beach, the sand rough under his boots as they moved like shadows through terrain that wanted them dead. He remembered the firefight that erupted when they breached the compound, the chaos of bullets and explosions, the screaming in languages he didn't speak but understood perfectly, the universal language of combat. They'd gotten the pilot out, lost one of their own in the process, a kid named Tommy Reeves, 23 years old, from a small town in Kentucky. Tommy took 3 rounds to the chest covering their extraction. Frank had carried him to the helicopter, felt the life drain out of the young man's body even as he whispered, "We got him out, Tommy. Mission accomplished." Tommy had smiled just barely, and then he was gone. Frank received a silver star for that mission. It sat in a box in his closet now, along with 2 bronze stars, a purple heart, and commendations whose names most people wouldn't recognize. He never displayed them. Medals don't bring back the dead. They just remind you of the cost. "Yo, Earth to old man!" Trey's voice snapped Frank back to the present. "You having a senior moment? You forget where you are?" Marcus had moved closer now, close enough that Frank could smell the marijuana on his clothes mixed with cheap body spray. The kid was grinning, showing off a grill of fake gold that probably cost more than Frank's monthly VA check. "I think he's scared," Marcus said, looking at Trey for approval. "Look at him just standing there, probably about to piss himself." Devon, still on Frank's right flank, suddenly reached out and shoved Frank's shoulder. It wasn't a hard push, just enough to be disrespectful, to assert dominance. "Yeah, old man. You scared? You need to call someone? Call your grandkids or something?" Frank absorbed the push without moving, his body automatically compensating for the force. His feet were planted in a stance that most people wouldn't recognize, but any combat veteran would. Weight distributed, center of gravity low, ready to move in any direction at any moment. Decades of muscle memory don't just disappear because you collect social security. "I don't have grandkids," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness. There was something in the way he said it, a sadness that wasn't self-pity but simple truth. Frank had never married. There'd been women, of course, over the years. But how do you build a life with someone when you're gone for months at a time on missions you can't talk about? How do you promise to come home for dinner when you might be halfway around the world killing people your government won't admit you killed? How do you explain the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way you can't ever fully relax because somewhere deep in your brain you're always on patrol? By the time Frank retired at 52, the women who might have waited had moved on. And he didn't blame them. He'd chosen this life. He'd chosen the brotherhood of the teams over everything else. And most days, he didn't regret it. But on days like today, standing in a gas station parking lot being mocked by kids young enough to be his grandchildren, he felt the weight of that choice. Trey, sensing vulnerability in Frank's admission, pounced. "Ah, that's sad, old man. No grandkids, no family, probably no friends either. Just you and this piece of shit truck." He kicked one of the tires of Frank's pickup for emphasis. "This is what your life amounts to? This is what you fought for?" The cruelty in Trey's voice was casual, almost bored, like he was swatting a fly. To him, Frank was nothing, a nobody, an inconvenience. a source of momentary entertainment before they moved on to whatever else young men with too much money and too little purpose do with their evenings. Inside the store, Sarah was on the phone with 911, her voice shaking as she tried to explain the situation. "There's a group of men harassing an elderly customer," she said. "I don't know if it's going to get violent, but yes, I'll stay on the line. Please hurry." The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. "Units are being dispatched to your location. Can you describe the men involved?" Sarah peered through the window, her heart pounding. 5 of them, early 20s. They're surrounding him. One of them took his hat. I think, oh God, one of them just pushed him. Jerome had moved to the door now, his hand on the handle. His wife had called, asking when he'd be home, but he'd told her he needed a few more minutes. He couldn't just leave. His conscience wouldn't let him. But what could he do? He was 64 years old, had a bad hip and high blood pressure. These were young men, aggressive, probably armed. Getting involved could get him killed. But then Jerome looked at Frank's face through the window, saw the quiet dignity there, the refusal to cower, and something in Jerome's chest tightened. He thought about his own father, a Vietnam vet who'd come home to a country that spit on him, who'd worked 2 jobs his entire life and died at 70 without ever getting the respect he deserved. Jerome thought about all the men like his father, like this stranger in the parking lot, who'd given everything and received nothing but contempt in return. Jerome pushed open the door and stepped outside. "Hey!" he called out, his voice stronger than he felt. "Leave that man alone." Trey turned, irritation flashing across his face. "Who the fuck are you, old man number 2? He laughed. "What? It's Senior Citizen Day at the gas station?" "I said leave him alone," Jerome repeated, walking toward the group despite every instinct screaming at him to turn around. "He's not bothering anybody. Just give him back his hat and go on about your business." Jamal, still recording, swung his phone toward Jerome. "Yo, now we got 2 old dudes trying to act tough. This is classic." Marcus stepped toward Jerome, his chest puffed out. "Old man, you better get back in that store before you get hurt. This ain't got nothing to do with you." Jerome's hands were shaking, but he stood his ground. "It's got everything to do with me. It's got to do with any decent person who sees what's happening here." For a moment, Trey seemed to consider whether it was worth dealing with 2 old men instead of 1. But then his ego made the decision for him. He couldn't back down now. Not in front of his crew. Not while being recorded. "Aight, you know what?" Trey said, his voice dropping to something darker. "Both of y'all old motherfuckers need to learn some respect. You don't know who you fucking with." He stepped toward Jerome, and that's when Frank moved. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. Frank simply shifted his position, placing himself between Trey and Jerome, his body language changing in a way that anyone with combat experience would immediately recognize. His shoulders squared, his weight settled. His hands, which had been loose at his sides, came up slightly, not in fists but in a ready position. "Step back," Frank said, and for the first time there was steel in his voice, not anger, not fear, just absolute certainty. Trey stopped, something in Frank's tone triggering a primal response that his conscious mind couldn't quite identify. For just a second, standing that close to the old man, Trey felt something he hadn't felt in years. Something like caution. But the moment passed. Trey's pride wouldn't allow it. He laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, now Grandpa wants to play hero? You gonna protect your little friend here?" Devin and Marcus moved to flank Frank again, this time more aggressively. The playful mockery was evaporating, being replaced by something more dangerous. Jamal kept recording, narrating for his social media audience. "Yo, this old dude really think he gonna do something. This is about to get crazy." Frank's jaw tightened. He could feel the situation spiraling, feel the energy shifting from humiliation to violence. These kids had no idea what they were doing. They thought they were tough because they'd probably been in a few street fights, pushed around some people who wouldn't push back. They had no concept of real violence, of what happens when training and experience meet desperation. Frank didn't want to hurt them. Despite everything, despite the disrespect and the cruelty, he didn't want to hurt these kids. They were somebody's sons. Somebody had loved them once, maybe still did. They were products of a system that had failed them, of neighborhoods that had taught them that strength came from intimidation, that respect came from fear. But Frank also knew that sometimes the only way to teach a lesson is through action. "Last chance," Frank said quietly. "Give me back my hat. Walk away. This doesn't have to go any further." Trey's face twisted into something ugly. He stepped forward until he was inches from Frank's face, so close that Frank could see the tiny scar above his left eyebrow, probably from some childhood accident. Could see the young man beneath the bravado, could see someone who'd probably never known what it meant to truly struggle, to truly sacrifice. "Or what, old man?" Trey said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What you gonna do?" The moment hung there, suspended in time. Sarah, still on the phone with 911, was being told that police were 3 minutes away. Jerome stood behind Frank, his fists clenched, praying this wouldn't end the way his gut told him it might. The other customers inside the store had moved away from the windows, not wanting to witness whatever came next. And Frank Delaney, who had faced terrorists, enemy soldiers, and the darkest moments human beings can endure, who had made split-second decisions that saved lives and took them, who had carried the weight of America's secrets in the most dangerous corners of the world, looked at this young man trying so hard to be dangerous and felt something unexpected: pity. But pity wouldn't save Trey from what was about to happen, because some lessons can only be learned the hard way, and some men, no matter how patient, eventually reach their limit. The seconds that followed felt like they were happening underwater, each moment stretched and distorted. Trey's breath was hot on Frank's face, carrying the smell of energy drinks and misplaced confidence. Behind them, a car pulled into the gas station, the driver taking one look at the scene and immediately driving away, wanting no part of whatever was unfolding. The sun had dipped low enough now that the automatic lights flickered on, casting harsh shadows across the pavement. "I asked you a question, old man," Trey said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "What you gonna do?" Frank's response was so quiet that only Trey could hear it. "More than you can imagine." Something in those words, in the absolute certainty behind them, should have been a warning. But Trey was too far gone, too committed to the performance, too surrounded by his audience to recognize danger when it was standing 2 inches from his face. Instead, Trey did something that crossed a line even his crew wasn't expecting. He spit, not at Frank, but near his feet, a gesture of ultimate disrespect that made even Marcus wince slightly. "That's what I think of you and your little Navy career," Trey said. "You ain't shit. You just another old man who can't accept that your time is over." Jerome took a step forward, unable to stay silent. "Son, you need to stop this. You don't know—" "Shut the fuck up!" Devon snapped at Jerome, pointing an aggressive finger at him. "Nobody asked you nothing. You want some of this too?" Inside Frank's mind, memories were cascading now, not the training or the missions, but the aftermath. The years that followed his retirement. The slow, painful realization that the world he'd protected had no place for him anymore. 2008, San Diego, California. The VA hospital. Frank had been sitting in a waiting room for 3 hours, his knee swollen to twice its normal size, the pain radiating up his leg like fire. He'd filled out all the paperwork, provided his service records, explained that he'd injured it during active duty and it had never properly healed. The receptionist had barely looked at him, just handed him a number and told him to wait. When he finally saw a doctor, a young resident who couldn't have been more than 30, the man had spent 5 minutes examining him before writing a prescription for ibuprofen and suggesting he try to stay active. "That's it?" Frank had asked, incredulous. "I'm telling you, this injury is service-related. I have documentation, Mr. Delaney." The doctor had interrupted, already standing up, ready to move to the next patient. "You're 70 years old. Some joint pain is normal. Take the medication, do some gentle stretching. You'll be fine." Frank had wanted to explain that this wasn't some joint pain, that this was the result of a night jump where his parachute had only partially deployed, where he'd hit the ground hard enough to crack his patella, but had to keep moving because the mission didn't stop for injuries. That he'd completed that mission with a broken kneecap, extracted 2 assets from hostile territory, and only sought medical attention 3 days later when the infection had set in. But the doctor was already opening the door, calling for the next patient. Frank was just a number, just another old veteran clogging up the system. 2012. A grocery store in the same town. Frank had been in line with his cart, just a few items: bread, eggs, milk, the basics. The young woman behind the register was texting on her phone, barely acknowledging customers as she scanned their items. When Frank's turn came, she didn't look up, just started scanning. "Thank you," Frank had said, trying to be polite. She hadn't responded, just told him the total. Frank had pulled out his wallet, his fingers not quite working right that day, the arthritis making it hard to grip the bills. He fumbled for a moment, trying to extract a $20 bill. The woman sighed loudly, impatiently. "Can you hurry up? There's a line." Frank had looked behind him. There was one person waiting, a middle-aged man who didn't seem bothered at all. Frank managed to get the bill out, handed it over. "Jesus," the cashier had muttered, just loud enough for Frank to hear. Old people shouldn't be allowed out during rush hour. Frank had taken his change, his groceries, and walked out. In his car, he'd sat for 10 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, wondering when exactly he'd become invisible, wondering when his service, his sacrifice, had stopped mattering. 2015, a job interview. Despite his retirement benefits, Frank had needed extra income. The cost of living kept rising, and his VA disability check only covered so much. He'd applied for a position as a security consultant for a private firm, figuring his decades of experience would make him valuable. The interviewer had been a man in his 40s, wearing an expensive suit and a condescending smile. He'd glanced at Frank's resume, noticed the dates of his service, and done some quick mental math. "Mr. Delaney," he'd said, "I appreciate your service, I really do. My uncle was in the military, but we're looking for someone with more contemporary skills. The security landscape has changed a lot since your time." "I stay current," Frank had said. "I've taken courses in cybersecurity, modern surveillance techniques." "I'm sure you have," the man had interrupted, in a tone that made it clear he wasn't sure at all. "But we're also looking for someone who can grow with the company, someone with a longer timeline ahead of them." "You understand." Frank had understood perfectly. He was too old. They didn't want to invest in training someone who might retire or die in a few years. Never mind that Frank was in better shape than most men half his age. Never mind that his knowledge and experience were irreplaceable. He was old, and in America, old meant obsolete. Back in the gas station parking lot, the present moment. These memories flashed through Frank's mind in seconds. A lifetime of disrespect and dismissal condensed into a single painful awareness. Every doctor who dismissed his pain. Every clerk who'd treated him as an inconvenience. Every interviewer who'd seen his age before his abilities. Every person who'd looked at him and seen only what he could no longer do, never what he'd done. And now these kids, these arrogant, ignorant kids who'd never fought for anything, who'd never sacrificed anything, who'd probably never experienced a single day of real hardship, were standing here mocking him, mocking the hat that represented years of his life given to something bigger than himself. Frank felt something shift inside him, something he'd kept locked down for years. Not anger, not exactly. It was more like a door opening, a part of himself he'd deliberately kept sealed for the safety of everyone around him, the part that had been trained to be a weapon. Trey, mistaking Frank's silence for fear, pushed harder. He reached out and poked Frank in the chest with one finger, each poke emphasizing his words. "You ain't Shit! Marcus laughed and moved closer. Yo, Trey, let me get a piece of this. I want to mess with Grandpa, too. He reached for Frank's shoulder, intending to shove him again, harder this time. That's when Devon made his mistake. Still holding Frank's navy cap, he threw it on the ground and stepped on it, grinding it into the dirty asphalt with his sneaker. That's what we think of your service, old man, Devon said, grinning. Jerome gasped. Oh no, son, you shouldn't have done that. The atmosphere changed instantly. Even Trey felt it, though he couldn't have explained what shifted. Frank's expression didn't change. His posture didn't change, but something in his eyes, that steel-gray intensity, went from cold to arctic. Frank looked down at his cap being ground into the pavement. That cap had been a gift from his last commanding officer when he'd retired. Inside the brim, written in faded ink, were the words, "To Frank, the best warrior I ever served with. Fair winds and following seas." It was one of the few possessions Frank truly valued, not because of what it represented to others, but because of what it represented to him, his brothers, his sacrifice, his identity. "Pick it up," Frank said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. Devon laughed. "What? You want your precious little hat? Maybe you should get down on your hands and knees and pick it up yourself, old man. Beg for it." Trey was emboldened now, sensing they'd found Frank's breaking point. "Yeah, that's a good idea. Get down and beg. Show us some of that military discipline. Get on your knees, soldier." The others joined in, a chorus of cruel laughter and mocking commands. "On your knees! Beg for it. Show us some respect." Jamal's phone captured everything, his commentary getting more excited. "Yo, this dude about to make this old man beg. This is crazy. This is gonna go so viral." Sarah, still on the phone with 911, was crying now. "They're humiliating him. They're making him... Oh God, please tell me the police are almost here." 2 minutes, the dispatcher said. "Tell them help is on the way." But 2 minutes might as well have been 2 hours. Frank stood perfectly still, his eyes moving from his cap on the ground to Devon's face, then to Trey's, then to each member of the crew. He was cataloguing them, memorizing every detail, every feature. It was automatic, instinctive, target identification, threat assessment. "I'm not going to ask again," Frank said. "Pick up the hat." Or what? Trey was right in Frank's face now, so close their noses almost touched. "What you gonna do, old man? Huh? You gonna fight all 5 of us? You can barely stand up straight. You probably can't even make a fist without your arthritis flaring up." To emphasize his point, Trey reached out and grabbed Frank's right hand, squeezing it, trying to prove his point about the arthritis. "See? Look how weak he is. Probably can't even..." Trey never finished that sentence. What happened next happened so fast that Jamal's phone barely caught it, just a blur of movement that his camera couldn't quite focus on in time. Frank's hand, the one Trey was holding, suddenly rotated inward in a movement that was so smooth it seemed effortless. His fingers locked around Trey's wrist, found the pressure point between the bones, and applied just enough force to make Trey's entire arm go numb. Simultaneously, Frank's other hand came up, not in a punch, but in a controlled strike to Trey's solar plexus. Not hard enough to cause real damage, but precisely calibrated to knock the wind out of him. Trey's eyes went wide. His mouth opened in a gasp that produced no sound. His legs buckled. The entire movement took less than 2 seconds. Frank released Trey's wrist and stepped back, letting the young man crumple to his knees, gasping for air, his face turning red as his diaphragm spasmed. The parking lot went silent. Marcus, Devon, Jamal, and the 5th crew member, whose name was Chris, they all froze, their brains struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. The old man, the frail, shaking, weak old man they'd been mocking, had just dropped Trey like he was nothing. "What the fuck?" Marcus finally managed, his voice cracking. Frank didn't respond. He calmly walked over to where his cap lay on the ground, bent down, his knees protesting but holding, and picked it up. He brushed off the dirt carefully, tenderly, then placed it back on his head. When he turned back to face them, his expression hadn't changed. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't angry. He was just present. Fully, completely present in a way that made every one of them suddenly aware of how outmatched they were. Trey was still on his knees, trying to breathe, making horrible wheezing sounds. He attacked Trey, Devon shouted, though his voice lacked conviction. Did you see that? He attacked him. I defended myself, Frank said calmly. Your friend grabbed me first. I simply responded to a physical threat. Jerome, who'd been ready to jump in to help, found himself just standing there in awe. He'd seen bar fights, street fights, even witnessed a few altercations in his younger days, but he'd never seen anyone move like that, so controlled, so precise, so absolutely devoid of wasted motion. Marcus pulled out his phone, fingers shaking as he dialed. I'm calling the cops. You just assaulted my boy. Please do, Frank said. I'm sure they'll be interested in the video your friend has been recording, the one that shows 5 young men surrounding, mocking, and physically accosting an elderly veteran. I'm sure that will make for interesting viewing. Jamal's face went pale. He stopped recording abruptly, suddenly realizing that his video evidence didn't show what he thought it showed. It showed them as the aggressors. It showed Frank as the victim. And it showed Frank defending himself with minimal force. Chris, the 5th member, who'd been mostly quiet until now, took a step back. Yo, maybe we should just go. This ain't worth it. But Devon's pride was hurt, and hurt pride makes men stupid. He reached into his waistband, and for one terrible moment, everyone thought he might pull out a gun. But what he pulled out was a knife, not a large one, just a folding blade, maybe 4 inches long. Still, it was a weapon, and pulling it changed everything. You think you tough, old man? Devon said, his hand shaking as he held the knife. Let's see how tough you are now. Jerome's blood ran cold. Sarah screamed from inside the store. Jamal started backing away, not wanting any part of this escalation. And Frank Delaney, who had faced men with AK-47s, who had disarmed suicide bombers, who had once taken down 3 armed hostage takers with nothing but his bare hands and 30 seconds of action, looked at that little folding knife and almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he spoke 4 words that would haunt Devon for the rest of his life. Put that away, son. The way Frank said it, not threatening, not afraid, just calm, almost paternal, made Devon realize something terrifying. The old man wasn't scared of the knife. He wasn't even concerned about it. He was giving Devon a chance, one final opportunity to walk away before something irreversible happened. Trey had finally caught his breath and was getting to his feet, one hand on his chest, his face still flushed. He looked at Frank with new eyes, eyes that were trying to reconcile what he'd believed with what he'd just experienced. Who the fuck are you? Trey managed, his voice hoarse. Frank considered the question. Behind them, they could hear sirens now, still distant but getting closer. The police were maybe a minute away. Frank could wait, could let them handle this, could press charges and watch these kids face consequences. But that's not what Frank wanted. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want these kids in jail. What he wanted was something much simpler and much harder to achieve. He wanted them to understand. So Frank reached into his jacket pocket, the same pocket they'd eyed suspiciously earlier, and pulled out his wallet. From the wallet, he extracted a card, plastic and official, with a seal and a photograph and words that would change everything. He held it up so they could all see it. My name is Frank Delaney, he said quietly. Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy SEALs, retired. 28 years of service, SEAL Team 6, 3 combat deployments that I can talk about, and 7 that I can't. I've been shot 4 times, stabbed twice, and survived 2 helicopter crashes. I've pulled 23 men out of situations they shouldn't have survived. And I've put down threats to this nation that you'll never read about in any history book. The ID card gleamed in the harsh fluorescent light of the gas station. It was real, unmistakably, officially real, the kind of ID that can't be faked, that comes with verification codes and security features. Marcus stared at it, his mouth open. Chris had gone completely pale. Jamal looked like he might be sick. Even Devon, still holding his knife, seemed frozen. "SEAL Team 6? Trey whispered, the words barely audible. Even young men who'd never served knew what those words meant. They'd seen the movies, heard the stories. Osama bin Laden, hostage rescues. The most elite, most dangerous, most highly trained special operations force in the United States military. "Now," Frank continued, his voice still calm, still measured, "I'm going to give you all a choice. Your friend there can put away his knife. You can apologize, not to me, I don't need your apologies, but to yourselves, for acting like the kind of men I spent my career protecting this country from. And then you can get in your expensive cars and drive away from here and maybe, just maybe, think about the kind of men you want to be." He paused, letting that sink in. "Or," Frank continued, "your friend can keep holding that knife. The police can arrive and see him threatening a decorated veteran. And you can all learn about consequences the hard way. Your choice. You've got about 30 seconds before those sirens get here." But what these young men didn't realize, what they were only beginning to understand, was that they'd spent the last 20 minutes humiliating a man who'd already survived the worst that life and war could throw at him. And now, standing in that parking lot with their false bravado crumbling around them, they were about to learn what real strength looks like. The knife in Devon's hand trembled, not from aggression now, but from something else entirely, the sudden, overwhelming realization that he'd crossed a line he didn't even know existed. The blade caught the harsh fluorescent light, creating dancing shadows on the pavement, and for the first time since this confrontation began, Devon understood that he was holding not a weapon of power, but evidence of his own stupidity. Devon started, but his voice cracked. He looked at Trey, seeking guidance, seeking permission to back down. But Trey was still staring at Frank's ID card like it was a death sentence written in plastic and laminate. The sirens were closer now, maybe 20 seconds away. The pulsing red and blue lights were beginning to reflect off the gas station windows, creating an eerie strobe effect across the parking lot. Sarah had emerged from the store, standing in the doorway with her phone still pressed to her ear, tears streaming down her face. Jerome stood off to the side, his hand over his mouth, watching history unfold. "SEAL Team 6. Marcus repeated, the words coming out like a prayer or a curse. He couldn't tell which. "Man, we didn't know. We didn't—" "That's exactly the problem," Frank interrupted, his voice cutting through Marcus's stammering with surgical precision. "You didn't know, you didn't ask, you didn't consider. You saw an old man and decided that made him worthless, that made him weak. That made him someone you could humiliate for entertainment." Frank took a single step forward, and despite the fact that he'd just proven he could handle himself, despite the knife still in Devon's shaking hand, all 5 young men instinctively stepped back. It wasn't his physical movement that scared them now. It was the weight of his words, the truth they carried. "You want to know something?" Frank continued, his steel-gray eyes moving from one face to another. "I've met real warriors, men who sacrificed everything, including their lives, for people they'd never meet. I've stood over the graves of brothers who died protecting the freedom that lets you drive those expensive cars and mock strangers without consequence. And you know what those men would say if they could see this? They'd say they died for your right to be exactly who you are, free, privileged, ignorant." Trey had found his voice again, though it came out smaller than before, stripped of all its earlier bravado. Look, man, we made a mistake. We didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Frank said flatly. "You absolutely meant it. You meant every word, every laugh, every degrading comment. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. You meant it because you've never been taught that actions have consequences. You've never learned that respect isn't taken, it's earned. And you've certainly never understood that strength isn't about who you can intimidate. It's about who you protect." The police cruiser pulled into the gas station parking lot, lights blazing. the siren cutting off abruptly as two officers emerged. One was a veteran cop named Officer Torres, 52 years old, with gray at his temples and 28 years on the force. The other was a younger officer, Patterson, maybe 30, with the kind of alert intensity that came from still being new enough to see every call as potentially life-threatening. "All right, everybody step back," Torres called out, his hand resting on his duty belt, ready but not aggressive. His eyes scanned the scene quickly, professionally. 5 young men, 1 elderly man, 1 person holding what appeared to be a knife, 1 witness on the phone, another witness standing to the side. Standard stuff, except something about the way the old man stood told Torres this wasn't as standard as it appeared. "Officer," Devon started, finally thinking clearly enough to realize he was still holding a blade with cops present. He quickly folded it and dropped it on the ground, raising his hands. "Officer, this man attacked my friend. We got it on video." "That's not what happened," Sarah called out from the doorway, her voice high and strained. "They were harassing him, 5 against 1. They took his hat and threw it on the ground. They surrounded him." Torres raised a hand, calling for quiet. "Everyone calm down. Nobody's going anywhere until we figure out what happened here. Patterson, collect that knife. Bag it as evidence." The younger officer moved forward carefully, picking up the folding knife with a gloved hand and placing it in an evidence bag. "Got it, sir." Torres turned to Frank, and something in the officer's expression shifted. There was recognition there, not of Frank specifically, but of a type. Torres was a Navy veteran himself, had served on a destroyer during the First Gulf War. He knew how to read military bearing, and the man standing in front of him had it in spades despite his age. "Sir," Torres said, his tone respectful, "can you tell me your name and what happened here?" "Frank Delaney," Frank said calmly, "Master Chief Petty Officer, U.S. Navy, retired. These young men approached me as I was entering the store. They began verbally harassing me, took my hat, threw it on the ground, made physical contact first. When one of them pulled a knife, I felt my safety was threatened. But I didn't escalate beyond defending myself." Torres's eyebrows rose slightly at the rank and service. "Master Chief? Navy? SEALs," Frank clarified, pulling out his ID card again. 28 years. Torres took the ID, examined it carefully, then looked at Frank with new eyes. "SEALs," he repeated, then glanced at the 5 young men whose false bravado had now completely evaporated. "Jesus Christ, you kids picked the wrong target." "We didn't know," Trey said desperately. "How were we supposed to know? He just looked like what?" Torres interrupted sharply. "Like someone you could push around? Like someone who wouldn't fight back?" He shook his head in disgust. "Let me see this video you mentioned." Jamal hesitated, looking at his phone, then at his friends, then back at his phone. Slowly, reluctantly, he handed it to Officer Torres. It's on there, but nothing," Torres said, taking the phone. He pressed play and watched in silence as the video unfolded. Trey's mocking, the theft of the hat, the escalating aggression, Devon throwing the hat on the ground, multiple people making physical contact with Frank first, and then finally, Frank's precise, controlled response that had put Trey on his knees. When the video ended, Torres handed the phone to Patterson. "Log that as evidence, and get statements from the witnesses." He turned back to the 5 young men, and his expression had gone from professional to barely contained anger. "Do you understand what I'm looking at here?" Torres said, his voice tight. "I'm looking at 5 individuals engaging in assault and battery against an elderly veteran. I'm looking at theft, that hat. I'm looking at menacing with a weapon. I'm looking at enough charges to put you all away for a few years, minimum." Chris, who'd been silent for most of this, suddenly bent over and vomited on the pavement, the stress and fear finally overwhelming his system. Trey looked like he might cry. Marcus had his hands on his head, staring at the ground. Devon was shaking so badly he could barely stand. "Please," Trey managed. "Please, officer, we made a mistake. We're sorry. We didn't mean for it to go this far." "You didn't mean to get caught," Torres corrected coldly. There's a difference. Frank watched this unfold with no satisfaction, no vindication. He just looked tired, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with disappointment. Not disappointment in these kids specifically, but in what they represented. A generation that had grown up without understanding sacrifice, without understanding honor, without understanding that every action ripples outward in ways you can't predict or control. Jerome stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Officer, if I may, I witnessed the whole thing. This man," he gestured to Frank, "showed more restraint than they deserved. He could have seriously hurt them. He had every right to defend himself more aggressively. But he didn't. He used the minimum force necessary. And even now, look at him. He's not pressing for revenge. He's just standing there." Torres looked at Frank. "Is that true, sir? You want to press charges?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence everyone waited. The 5 young men held their breath. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. Jerome watched intently. Even the officers seemed to lean in slightly, waiting for judgment to be passed. Finally, Frank spoke. "What's your name?" he asked, looking directly at Trey. Trey swallowed hard. Trey Morrison. How old are you, Trey?" 23. Frank nodded slowly. 23. You know what I was doing when I was 23? He didn't wait for an answer. "I was in Mogadishu. You ever heard of that place? Mogadishu, Somalia, 1993. Look it up when you get home, if you still have a home to go to after tonight." Trey's face had gone pale. Even he knew what had happened in Mogadishu. Even he had seen Black Hawk Down. "I watched friends die in that city," Frank continued quietly. "Good men, better men than I'll ever be. They died protecting each other, protecting Somali civilians, protecting a mission they believed in. And you know what? None of them were perfect. They'd made mistakes. They'd been stupid kids once, just like you. But they grew up. They learned. They became something more than their worst impulses." Frank took a breath, and when he continued, his voice was softer, almost gentle. "I don't want to press charges, not because you don't deserve it, you absolutely deserve it, but because sending you to prison won't teach you what you need to learn. It'll just make you bitter. It'll just make you hate instead of understand." Torres looked surprised. "Sir, are you sure? These men assaulted you. They threatened you with a weapon." "I'm sure," Frank said, "but I have conditions." "Conditions?" Patterson asked, confused. Frank turned back to the 5 young men. "Each of you is going to do 200 hours of community service at the VA hospital. You're going to spend time with veterans. You're going to hear their stories. You're going to see what sacrifice actually looks like. You're going to learn that the old, broken people you see shuffling around in hospital gowns are heroes who gave parts of themselves, physically, mentally, emotionally, so that you could have the freedom to be the arrogant, ignorant boys you are today." He paused, letting that sink in. "And you," Frank said, pointing at Jamal, "you're going to post that video, the whole thing, unedited, with a full explanation of what happened, what you did, and what you learned. You want viral content? Fine. Let the world see you at your worst. Let them see what happens when respect is forgotten, and let them see you taking responsibility." Jamal looked horrified. "But that'll ruin me. My reputation." "Your reputation." Frank's voice hardened. "You were willing to ruin mine for entertainment. You were willing to humiliate a stranger for clicks and likes. Now you're going to own what you did. That's called accountability." Torres considered this, then looked at his partner. "Patterson, go run their IDs. Check for warrants, priors, anything outstanding." He turned back to Frank. "Sir, I respect your decision, but I need to make sure these individuals don't have a history that would make leniency unwise." Patterson collected IDs from all 5 young men and retreated to the patrol car. The minutes that followed were excruciating. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the gentle hum of the gas station's lights and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Finally, Patterson returned, his expression grim. Torres, we got hits. Morrison has 2 outstanding warrants, one for assault, one for drug possession. Rodriguez, he gestured at Marcus, has a suspended license and a bench warrant for failure to appear. The others are clean, but Morrison and Rodriguez need to come in. Torres nodded, his face hardening. Trey Morrison, Marcus Rodriguez, you're under arrest. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. No! Trey's voice cracked. No, please! The old man said he wasn't pressing charges. You can't... I'm not arresting you for what happened here, Torres said as he produced handcuffs. I'm arresting you on outstanding warrants. That's not something anyone can drop. Those are from prior incidents. You should have handled them when you had the chance. As Torres cuffed Trey, the young man's face crumbled. All the arrogance, all the swagger, all the false confidence, it disappeared, replaced by the terrified face of a young man who'd finally run out of second chances. I'm sorry, he said, looking at Frank. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. You didn't care, Frank corrected gently. That was the problem. You didn't know and you didn't care to know. Marcus was crying openly now as Patterson cuffed him. My mom's gonna kill me. Oh God, my mom. Torres looked at Devon, Chris, and Jamal. You 3 are free to go, but I'm going to hold you to Master Chief Delaney's conditions, 200 hours each at the VA hospital, and that video gets posted. Full accountability. If I hear that any of you failed to follow through, I'll find charges to bring, understand? All 3 nodded frantically. And if I ever, Torres continued, his voice dropping to something dangerous, ever catch any of you harassing elderly people, veterans, or anyone else who can't easily defend themselves, I will throw the book at you so hard you'll be reading it from a jail cell. Are we clear? Yes, sir, they chorused. Get out of here, and count yourselves lucky. Devon, Chris, and Jamal didn't need to be told twice. They practically ran to their cars, engines roaring to life, tires squealing as they pulled out of the parking lot like it was on fire. Torres guided Trey and Marcus to the patrol car, reading them their rights in a practiced monotone. As he opened the back door, Trey looked back one more time at Frank. I really am sorry, he said, and this time there might have been genuine remorse in his voice. For what it's worth, Frank nodded slightly. Use your time wisely. Learn something. Become better. The patrol car doors closed with a final, definitive thunk. Torres returned to Frank, extending his hand. Master Chief, it's an honor, really. I served too, though nothing like what you did, and I'm sorry this happened to you. Frank shook his hand. Thank you, officer. And thank you for your service as well. Gulf War, destroyer duty, nothing special. All service is special, Frank said simply. Torres smiled at that, then turned to leave. You need anything, sir? Ride home? Medical attention? I'm fine, Frank said. Just need to pay for my gas and go home. Your gas is on me, Sarah called out from the doorway. Please, it's the least I can do. Frank looked at her, at this young woman who'd been brave enough to call for help, brave enough to stand up when others looked away. You don't have to do that. I know, Sarah said, wiping her eyes. But I want to. What you did, how you handled that. That was incredible. Jerome approached, extending his hand. Sir, I'm Jerome Washington, and I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for how you handled these young men. And thank you for being the kind of man who gives second chances even when they're not deserved. Frank shook his hand warmly. You stood up when it would have been easier to stay inside. That took courage. Not as much courage as you've shown in your lifetime, I suspect. The patrol car pulled away, red and blue lights fading into the distance, carrying Trey and Marcus toward a reckoning they'd spent years avoiding. The parking lot slowly emptied. A few customers who'd been hiding inside emerged cautiously, looking at Frank with new eyes. One of them, an older woman with gray hair and kind eyes, approached. Young man, she said, and Frank almost smiled at being called young. I saw what happened, and I want you to know that not everyone has forgotten. Not everyone has stopped caring. Some of us still remember what you and men like you have done for this country. "Thank you, ma'am," Frank said softly. She pulled something from her purse, a small American flag pin, and pressed it into his hand. "My husband was a Marine, Vietnam. He died 5 years ago and he never quite recovered from what he saw over there. But he was proud of his service, proud of men like you. I think he'd want you to have this." Frank looked down at the tiny pin, feeling its weight in his palm, and for the first time that evening his eyes grew damp. "I'll treasure this, thank you." The woman smiled, patted his arm and walked back to her car. Frank stood there in the parking lot, the sun now completely set, the stars beginning to emerge overhead. His knee ached from the earlier movement. His hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline finally wearing off, but he was still standing, still here. And as he walked back to his truck, his navy cap firmly on his head, the flag pin safely in his pocket, Frank Delaney allowed himself a small smile, because sometimes, just sometimes, the world remembered. Sometimes justice found its way, and sometimes the lessons that needed teaching got taught. 3 days later, the world discovered Frank Delaney. It started with Jamal's video. True to his word, enforced by the very real threat of Officer Torres's wrath and his own growing sense of shame, Jamal posted the entire unedited footage to his social media accounts. But he didn't just post it. He wrote a caption that would be shared, screenshotted, and quoted thousands of times over the following weeks. "I need to own something. 3 days ago, me and my crew did something I'm ashamed of. We mocked, harassed, and threatened an elderly man at a gas station. We thought he was weak. We thought he was nobody. We were wrong. This man is Master Chief Frank Delaney, Navy SEAL, SEAL Team 6, 28 years of service, a genuine American hero, and we treated him like garbage. This video shows what we did, all of it. I'm posting it because I need to be held accountable, because hiding from our mistakes doesn't make us better. Watch it, learn from it, and never, ever judge someone by what you think you see." The video went viral within 6 hours. By the next morning, it had 15 million views. By that evening, 30 million. News outlets picked it up, local stations, national networks, cable news, even international media. The story had everything: a decorated war hero, arrogant young men getting their comeuppance, a lesson about respect and dignity. It was redemption and justice wrapped in a neat, shareable package. Frank's phone, which he'd kept the same number for 20 years despite the limited calls he received, suddenly wouldn't stop ringing. At first, he didn't answer. He didn't understand why everyone wanted to talk to him. He'd just done what needed doing. He'd defended himself, shown restraint, and offered a teaching moment. That's what men like him did. It wasn't special. But the world disagreed. The first call he finally answered was from a reporter at the San Diego Union-Tribune named Lisa Chen, a woman in her 40s with a reputation for human interest, stories that actually meant something. "Master Chief Delaney," she said when Frank answered, her voice professional but warm. "I know you're probably overwhelmed right now, but I'd love the opportunity to tell your story properly. Not just what happened at the gas station, but who you are, what you've done, what you've sacrificed. America needs to hear from men like you." Frank sat in his small living room, looking around at the modest space he called home. The walls were mostly bare except for a few photographs. His SEAL team from 1987, a commendation ceremony where he'd received one of his Bronze Stars, a group photo from his final deployment. No fancy furniture, no expensive electronics, just the basics, clean, functional, enough. "Ms. Chen," Frank said slowly, "I appreciate the interest, but I'm not sure what there is to tell. I served my country. I did my job, that's all." "That's exactly what there is to tell," Lisa responded. "Master Chief, do you know how many people have reached out to our news desk in the last 12 hours? Hundreds. Veterans who served with you, people from missions you were on, commanders who say you were the finest warrior they ever knew. And civilians, regular people who are saying that seeing how you handled that situation gave them hope. In a world that often feels like it's forgotten what honor looks like, You reminded them. Frank was quiet, processing this. I just didn't want those boys to go to prison. They made mistakes, but they're young. They can learn. And that's what makes you remarkable, Lisa said softly. You had every right to throw the book at them. Instead, you gave them a chance to become better. That's not weakness, Master Chief. That's strength. Frank agreed to the interview. 2 days later, Lisa Chen and a camera crew arrived at Frank's home. She'd done her homework, researching his service record as much as the classified nature of his work allowed. She'd found former teammates willing to go on record. She'd tracked down after-action reports from missions Frank had led. She'd built a picture of a man who'd spent nearly 3 decades being exceptional in the shadows. The interview took 4 hours. Frank talked about his childhood in a small town in Montana, the son of a coal miner and a school teacher. He talked about enlisting at 18, about basic training, about the grueling selection process for the SEALs that broke most men who attempted it. He talked about his first combat deployment, the fear and the adrenaline and the brotherhood that formed when you trusted your life to the men beside you. He talked about Mogadishu, though there were parts he couldn't discuss, parts that remained classified even decades later. He talked about the friends he'd lost, and his voice cracked when he mentioned Tommy Reeves, the young SEAL who died in the Persian Gulf, covering their extraction. Tommy was 23, Frank said, staring at something far away. Same age as that kid Trey at the gas station, same age. But Tommy knew what it meant to put others first. He knew what sacrifice looked like, and he made the ultimate sacrifice without hesitation. Lisa Chen, experienced journalist that she was, found herself wiping tears from her eyes. Do you think about them often? She asked gently. The ones who didn't make it home. Every single day, Frank said simply. Every morning when I wake up, every night before I sleep, I carry them with me. It's both a burden and an honor. The interview aired 3 days later, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. The newspaper's website crashed from traffic. The video of the interview was shared millions of times. Comments poured in, thousands of them, and for once, the internet was mostly united in something positive. This man is what a real hero looks like. Thank you for your service, Master Chief Delaney. You are not forgotten. Everyone should watch this. This is what character looks like. My grandfather was a SEAL. He never talked about his service either. Watching this made me understand him better. But it wasn't just online support. Real, tangible things began to happen. A local veterans organization reached out, offering to help with any needs Frank might have. A home improvement company, owned by a former Marine, showed up at Frank's house and offered to make repairs free of charge. The owner, a man named Mike Breslin with a prosthetic leg from an IED in Iraq, shook Frank's hand and said simply, "Brothers take care of brothers." Within a week, Frank's truck, that old beat-up rust-covered pickup that had been on its last legs, was replaced by a brand-new Ford F-150 donated by a grateful car dealership whose owner's son had served under a man who'd served under Frank. "I can't accept this," Frank protested when they tried to hand him the keys. "Master Chief," the dealership owner said, "my son told me that Commander Mitchell, who saved his life in Afghanistan, said the only reason he knew what to do in that situation was because of training he received from you years earlier. You saved my son's life without even knowing it. This truck is the least I can do." Frank accepted the keys, his hands shaking slightly, overwhelmed by generosity he didn't feel he'd earned. The VA hospital, the same one that had dismissed his pain years earlier, reached out with a formal apology and an offer to comprehensively address all his medical needs. The director, a woman named Dr. Patricia Vasquez, met with Frank personally. "Master Chief," she said, her voice heavy with remorse, "I've reviewed your file. I've seen how you were treated. It's inexcusable. We failed you, and I can only apologize and promise to do better." "It's not just me," Frank said quietly. "There are thousands like me. Tens of thousands. Veterans who gave everything and get nothing but bureaucracy and dismissal in return." "I know," Dr. Vasquez said. And I'm using your story, with your permission, to push for systemic changes. You've started a conversation that needs to happen. At the local high school, a teacher named Robert Hammond, who'd been struggling to get his students to understand the concept of civic duty and sacrifice, asked if Frank would be willing to speak to his history class. Frank hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of being put on display, but ultimately agreed. The day he walked into that classroom, 40 teenagers who'd been on their phones, bored and disengaged, looked up. They'd seen the video. They knew who he was. And for 50 minutes, they sat in absolute silence as Frank talked about service, about sacrifice, about the difference between looking strong and being strong. Strength isn't about muscles or weapons or how loud you can yell, Frank told them, his voice filling the quiet room. Strength is about doing the right thing when it's easier to do nothing. It's about standing up when everyone else sits down. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. And most importantly, it's about being able to walk away from a fight you could easily win. Because winning isn't always what matters most. A girl in the front row raised her hand tentatively. Master Chief, after everything you've been through, after how some people have treated you, how are you not angry all the time? Frank considered the question carefully. I didn't say I'm not angry. Anger is human, it's natural. But I learned a long time ago that anger is a tool, not a master. You use it when necessary, but you don't let it use you. Those boys at the gas station, they were angry at the world, angry at their own insecurities, and they let that anger control them. I could have responded with my own anger. But what would that have accomplished? More violence, more pain, more young men in prison, more families broken. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is show mercy. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, not a single student moved. They sat there, transfixed, until Frank smiled and said, I think you're supposed to leave now. Don't want to get your teacher in trouble. They laughed and then they applauded, and as Frank left that classroom, several students approached him, asking for autographs, asking for advice, asking how they could serve their country. One young man, a senior named David with aspirations of joining the military, shook Frank's hand with reverence. Master Chief, David said, I want to be like you someday. Frank put a hand on the young man's shoulder. Don't be like me. Be better than me. Learn from my mistakes. And remember that serving your country doesn't always mean carrying a gun. Teachers serve, doctors serve. People who volunteer at homeless shelters serve. Find your way to make the world better. That's all any of us can do. Meanwhile, at the VA hospital, Devon, Chris, and Jamal had begun their community service. The first day had been awkward, uncomfortable. They'd shown up in their expensive clothes, their attitude still defensive, still resentful of being there. But by the end of the first week, something had begun to change. Devon was assigned to help in the prosthetics wing, working with veterans who'd lost limbs in service. He met a Marine named Carlos who'd lost both legs to an IED in Fallujah. Carlos was 32 years old, Frank's age when he'd been in his prime, and he'd never walk normally again. But Carlos didn't complain. He joked with the staff, encouraged newer amputees, and talked about his plans to compete in wheelchair marathons. You think I'm inspiring, Carlos had said to Devon one day, noticing the younger man staring. But I'm just living. That's what we do. We adapt. We overcome. And we don't let circumstances define us. Devon had gone home that night and, for the first time in years, really thought about what strength meant. Chris was working in the psychiatric ward, helping with veterans suffering from PTSD. He sat in on group therapy sessions, heard men and women talk about nightmares that never stopped, hypervigilance that made normal life impossible, survivor's guilt that ate at them every day. One veteran, a woman named Sarah Johnson who'd served in Iraq, told a story about watching her best friend die in a mortar attack. I see it every time I close my eyes, she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. But I'm here. I'm fighting to get better because that's what she would have wanted. She died fighting, so I'll live fighting. Chris realized with a shame that burned in his chest that he'd spent his entire life fighting for nothing. No cause, no purpose, just ego and image. These people had fought for something real, and they carried scars, visible and invisible, that he couldn't imagine bearing. Jamal was in the general ward, helping with daily tasks, bringing meals, assisting with mobility, just being present. He met a 90-year-old World War II veteran named Henry, who'd stormed the beaches of Normandy. Henry's hands shook so badly he couldn't hold a spoon without spilling, but he smiled constantly and told stories about his buddies, most of whom hadn't made it off that beach. "You know what I regret most?" Henry asked Jamal one day. "I regret that I didn't tell them enough how much they meant to me. We were young, you know. We thought we were invincible. We didn't say the important things because we thought we'd have time, but time isn't promised to anyone." Jamal thought about Frank, about how they'd mocked him, disrespected him, never once considering that he was a person with a history, with pain, with value. He thought about how close they'd come to seriously hurting someone who dedicated his life to protecting people like them. The three young men didn't talk much during their community service, but they didn't need to. They were each processing their own reckonings, their own realizations. Back at the gas station where it had all started, Sarah had printed out a photo from the viral video, the moment where Frank stood tall, his navy cap back on his head, his dignity restored, and framed it behind the register. Below it she'd written, "Real strength is quiet. Real heroes are humble. Never judge someone by what you see on the surface." Customers noticed it, asked about it. And Sarah told the story, every time, with pride. Officer Torres, who'd arrested Trey and Marcus, kept tabs on them through the system. Trey had posted bail but was facing serious charges from his previous warrants. In a strange twist, his public defender had reached out to Frank, asking if he'd be willing to write a character statement for Trey's sentencing hearing. "Why would I do that?" Frank had asked, genuinely curious. "Because," the public defender said, "you're the only person Trey talks about. He's told me at least a dozen times about what you said, about becoming better, about learning from mistakes. He's scared, Master Chief, really scared. And I think he's finally ready to change, but the judge needs to see that someone believes in him." Frank thought about Tommy Reeves, about all the young men he'd trained, about second chances and redemption. He wrote the letter. "Your Honor," it read, "I don't condone what Trey Morrison did, either to me or in his past actions that led to his current legal situation, but I believe in the capacity for human beings to change, to grow, to become better than their worst moments. Mr. Morrison is young. He made terrible choices, but I saw something in his eyes that day at the gas station, when he realized who I was, when he understood the gravity of his actions. I saw the beginning of awareness. I saw the potential for growth. I'm not asking you to excuse his behavior. I'm asking you to give him the opportunity to prove that one bad chapter doesn't have to define the entire book of his life. Everyone deserves a second chance, even those who don't think they deserve it. Respectfully, Frank Delaney, Master Chief Petty Officer, U.S. Navy, Rettebloem." The letter was read at Trey's sentencing hearing. The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Hawkins, who'd been on the bench for 20 years and had seen every excuse and manipulation tactic imaginable, paused after reading it. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Hawkins said, looking down at Trey from her elevated position, "do you understand what this letter represents? This man, whom you humiliated and threatened, is advocating for you. Not because you deserve it, but because he believes you can be better. The question is, do you believe you can be better?" Trey, standing in an orange jumpsuit with chains around his wrists, his hair no longer perfectly faded, his arrogance completely stripped away, nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I do. I want to be better. I want to be the kind of man worth that letter." Judge Hawkins sentenced Trey to 18 months in county jail with the possibility of early release for good behavior, followed by 3 years of probation and 500 additional hours of community service beyond what Frank had originally required. "Use this time wisely, Mr. Morrison," she said. "Master Chief Delaney has given you a gift. Don't waste it." Marcus received a similar sentence, and both young men began their time determined to prove that Frank's faith in them wasn't misplaced. 2 months after the gas station incident, Frank received a call from the Department of the Navy. A ceremony was being planned at Naval Base San Diego to honor Navy SEALs from various eras. Frank's name had been submitted for a special recognition, and his presence was requested. "I don't need any more medals," Frank protested. "It's not about medals, Master Chief," the officer on the phone said. "It's about visibility. It's about reminding the public that heroes don't disappear when they take off the uniform. Your story has done more for veteran awareness in 2 months than our public affairs office has done in 2 years. We'd be honored to have you there." Frank attended. The ceremony was held on a perfect San Diego afternoon, the sun bright but not too hot, a gentle breeze coming off the harbor. Hundreds of people attended, active duty SEALs, retired veterans, military families, and civilians who just wanted to show their support. When Frank's name was called and he walked to the podium, the applause was thunderous. It went on for a full minute, and Frank stood there, uncomfortable with the attention, waiting for it to die down so he could say his piece and sit back down. But when the crowd finally quieted, Frank looked out at all those faces, young and old, military and civilian, every background and ethnicity, and he felt something shift in his chest. These people weren't just applauding him, they were applauding what he represented. They were applauding service, sacrifice, honor. They were applauding values that sometimes felt forgotten, but were still alive, still important. "Thank you," Frank said simply, his voice amplified by the microphone. "I'm not comfortable being called a hero. Real heroes don't come home. Real heroes are names on walls, stars on banners, memories in the hearts of those who loved them. I'm just someone who was lucky enough to serve with heroes. Lucky enough to learn from them, and lucky enough to make it home when too many didn't." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "What happened at that gas station 2 months ago wasn't about me. It was about us, about who we are as a society, about whether we still value respect, dignity, and the understanding that every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Those young men who confronted me, they're not evil. They're just lost, and I hope they're finding their way now, because that's what second chances are for. That's what mercy is for. Not to excuse bad behavior, but to allow for growth, to allow for redemption." Frank looked out at the crowd, his steel-gray eyes moving from face to face. "To every veteran here, every person who's served in any capacity, I want you to know, you matter, your service matters, your sacrifice matters, and even when the world seems to forget, even when you feel invisible or dismissed or undervalued, remember that you are part of something bigger than yourself. You are part of a tradition of service that spans generations. And that tradition doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It continues in how you live your life, how you treat others, how you contribute to making this world a little bit better than you found it." The applause that followed was even longer, even louder. People were crying, veterans were saluting. And Frank Delaney, who'd spent 3 decades in the shadows, who'd never sought recognition or praise, allowed himself a moment to feel what he'd always denied himself: pride. Not in himself specifically, but in what he'd been part of. In the men and women who'd served beside him, before him and after him. In the unbroken chain of Americans who'd answered the call to serve something bigger than themselves. As the ceremony concluded and Frank stepped down from the podium, he was approached by dozens of people wanting to shake his hand, thank him, tell him their stories. He listened to each one, gave each person his full attention, honored each connection. And then, near the end of the line, he saw three familiar faces. Devon, Chris and Jamal stood there in simple clothes, no flashy jewelry, no designer labels. They looked different, humbled, changed. "Master Chief," Devon said, extending his hand tentatively, we wanted to come, to thank you for giving us a chance, for teaching us something we should have already known." Frank shook each of their hands. "How's the community service going?" "It's hard," Chris admitted, "hearing their stories, seeing what they've been through. It makes you realize how small your problems are, how stupid your priorities were." "Good," Frank said. "That's exactly what you should be learning." Jamal pulled out his phone. "Master Chief, can I show you something?" He navigated to his social media account. The video was still there, still being shared, still accumulating views. It was over 50 million now. But below it, Jamal had posted weekly updates about his community service, about what he was learning, about how the experience was changing him. "I'm using the platform for something good now," Jamal said. "Trying to educate instead of just entertain. Trying to show people that it's okay to admit you were wrong and work to be better." Frank nodded approvingly. "That takes courage. More courage than it took to post the original video." "We heard about what you did," Devon said quietly. "The letter you wrote for Trey, even after everything. Why did you do that?" Frank considered the question. "Because I've made mistakes too. I've done things I'm not proud of, and someone gave me a second chance when I needed it. Seemed right to pay that forward." The three young men stood there, and for a moment, nobody spoke. Then, almost simultaneously, they each straightened their posture and saluted. Frank, surprised, instinctively returned the salute. "You don't have to do that." "Yes, sir, we do," Devon said. "Maybe we're not military. Maybe we never will be. But we understand now what that salute means. Respect, honor, recognizing someone who's earned it." As they left, Frank watched them go, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that lessons learned could be passed on. Hope that mistakes could be corrected. Hope that the next generation, for all their faults and flaws, could still learn what it meant to be better. The sun set over San Diego that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. And Frank Delaney, decorated Navy SEAL, reluctant hero, accidental teacher, drove home in his new truck with a heart that for the first time in years felt full instead of heavy. Because justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes justice is about transformation, and sometimes the greatest victories are the ones where everyone walks away better than they started. 6 months had passed since that afternoon at the gas station. Half a year, 183 days, and in that time, the world had changed in small but meaningful ways. Frank Delaney's story had become more than just a viral moment. It had sparked a movement. Respect Our Veterans trended on social media for weeks. Schools across the country began inviting veterans to speak to students. The VA received increased funding after public outcry, demanded better treatment for those who'd served. Documentaries were made, books were written, and Frank, who'd lived most of his life in the shadows, had become the unlikely face of a conversation America desperately needed to have. But Frank himself, he remained remarkably unchanged by all of it. He still lived in the same modest house, though now it had a new roof and functioning plumbing thanks to Mike Breslin's home improvement company. He still woke up at 05:30 every morning, a habit ingrained by decades of military discipline. He still drove to the same diner for breakfast 3 times a week, where the waitress, a grandmother named Dolores, always saved him the corner booth and knew his order by heart. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast. The only real difference was that now, people recognized him. They'd approach his table, shake his hand, thank him for his service. Some asked for photos, others just wanted to tell him their own stories, about a grandfather who'd served in Korea, a son currently deployed in Kuwait, a daughter considering enlisting. Frank listened to every story with the same quiet attention, honored every connection, never rushed anyone away. "You've become famous," Dolores said one morning, refilling his coffee. "How's that feel?" Frank smiled slightly. "Strange. I spent my whole career being invisible. Hard to get used to being seen." "Well, you better get used to it," Dolores said, gesturing out the window where a news van was pulling into the parking lot. "Looks like someone wants another interview." Frank sighed, but it was a gentle sigh, not irritated, just resigned to his new reality. The reporter was a young man named Marcus Sullivan. No relation to Marcus Rodriguez from the gas station, though Frank made the mental note of the coincidental name from a national morning show. He was eager, professional, and respectful in a way that made Frank agree to the interview, despite his preference for privacy. "Master Chief?" Marcus Sullivan began once they were seated in the diner booth, camera rolling. "6 months ago, you were living a quiet life. Now you're on magazine covers, invited to speak at military academies, and credited with revitalizing public support for veterans. How has this changed you?" Frank thought about the question carefully, the way he thought about everything. "It hasn't changed who I am," he said finally, "but it's changed what I can do. I have a platform now, whether I wanted it or not, and I've decided to use it to shine a light on veterans who need help, on the issues that don't get enough attention, on the men and women who are still fighting battles long after they've come home. You've become an advocate," Marcus Sullivan observed. "I've become a voice." Frank corrected gently. "An advocate fights for change. A voice just makes sure people are heard. There's a difference." The interview covered familiar ground: the gas station incident, Frank's military service, his philosophy on respect and second chances. But toward the end, Marcus Sullivan asked a question that caught Frank off guard. "Master Chief, there are some people who say you were too lenient with those young men, that you should have pressed full charges, that showing mercy to people who assaulted you sends the wrong message. What would you say to those critics?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, his steel-grey eyes focused on something beyond the camera. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I'd say they're not wrong to feel that way," Frank began. "Accountability is important. Consequences are necessary. But I'd also ask them, what's the goal? Is it punishment, or is it transformation? Is it revenge, or is it making the world better? Those boys who confronted me, they made terrible choices. They deserve to face consequences, and they have. But if I'd pushed for maximum sentencing, they'd be in prison right now. And prison doesn't make most people better. It makes them harder, more bitter, more likely to re-offend." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "Instead, those young men are working at the VA hospital. They're hearing stories from veterans. They're learning empathy. They're discovering that strength isn't about domination. It's about service. Devon told me last week that he's considering becoming a physical therapist to work with wounded warriors. Chris is taking classes to become a counselor specializing in PTSD. Jamal is using his social media platform to highlight veteran issues and raise money for veteran charities. Would any of that have happened if they were sitting in a prison cell? I don't think so." Marcus Sullivan nodded slowly. "So you believe in rehabilitation over punishment?" "I believe in both," Frank said, "but I also believe that rehabilitation should be the goal. And punishment should be the tool we use to get there, not the destination itself. We've created a society that's very good at punishing people and very bad at helping them become better, and that doesn't serve anyone." The interview aired 2 days later and sparked another wave of conversation. Some agreed with Frank's philosophy, others vehemently opposed it. But the conversation itself was valuable, forcing people to think about justice, about mercy, about what kind of society they wanted to live in. At the VA hospital, Frank had become a regular presence, not for his own medical needs, though Dr. Vasquez had indeed ensured he received proper care for his knee and the arthritis that plagued his hands, but because he'd started volunteering. He'd visit different wards, sit with veterans, listen to their stories, offer what wisdom he could. One afternoon, Frank was in the psychiatric wing, sitting with a young Marine named Daniel, who'd returned from Afghanistan 3 months earlier. Daniel was 24 years old, suffering from severe PTSD and struggling with thoughts of suicide. He'd barely spoken since being admitted, responding to doctors and therapists with monosyllables or silence. But with Frank, something was different. Maybe it was the shared experience of combat. Maybe it was the fact that Frank didn't push or pry, just sat there in comfortable silence, present but not demanding. Maybe it was the recognition of one warrior by another. After 30 minutes of sitting together, Daniel finally spoke. "Do you still see them?" he asked quietly. "The people you killed?" Frank didn't flinch at the question. He'd been asked it before in various forms by various people. "Yes," he said simply. "Not every day anymore, but yes." "Does it get easier?" "No," Frank said honestly. "It gets different. You learn to carry it. You learn to understand that what you did was necessary, was in defense of something bigger than yourself. But easy? No, it's never easy." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there. I see the faces, I hear the sounds. I feel the blast wave from the IED that killed my squad leader, and I keep thinking, why him? Why not me? I was standing 3 feet away. 3 feet. Why did I survive and he didn't?" "Survivor's guilt," Frank said softly. "I know it well. I've lost count of how many brothers I've outlived. Good men. Better men than me in many ways. And for years, I asked the same question. Why them? Why not me? Did you find an answer?" Daniel's voice was desperate, pleading. Frank turned to look at the young Marine, and in his eyes was a depth of understanding that only comes from living through the same darkness. "The answer," Frank said slowly, "is that you survived because you did. There's no cosmic reason, no divine plan, no fairness to it. You survived, and now you have a choice. You can let that survival destroy you with guilt. You can waste the life your squad leader died protecting, or you can honor his memory by living, by fighting to get better, by using your experience to help others, by making sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain." Tears were streaming down Daniel's face now. "I don't know if I can." "Yes, you can," Frank said with absolute certainty. "Because you're a Marine. You've already survived the worst day of your life. Everything after that is just details, and I'm going to tell you something else. Asking for help isn't weakness. Fighting your demons isn't weakness. Admitting you're broken and working to fix yourself, that's the bravest thing a warrior can do." Frank reached out and put a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You're not alone in this fight. There are thousands of us who've walked this path, who've fought these battles, who've survived and learned to live again, and we're here. We're not going anywhere. You don't have to do this alone." Daniel broke down completely then, sobbing in a way he probably hadn't allowed himself to since coming home. And Frank just sat there, his hand on the young man's shoulder, letting him release years of pain and fear and guilt. When Daniel finally composed himself, he looked at Frank with red-rimmed eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "I've been so close to ending it, but maybe I can try to fight a little longer." "That's all any of us can do," Frank said. "Fight a little longer. 1 day at a time, 1 hour at a time if necessary, but keep fighting." After leaving the hospital that day, Frank sat in his truck in the parking lot for a long time, his hands on the steering wheel, emotions swirling in his chest. How many Daniels were out there? How many young men and women were fighting invisible battles without support, without hope, without someone to tell them they weren't alone? Too many. The answer was always too many. Frank pulled out his phone and made a call to Lisa Chen, the reporter who'd done his first major interview. "Lisa," he said when she answered, "I want to start a foundation, a non-profit, focused on connecting combat veterans with peer support, veterans helping veterans, people who understand because they've been there. Can you help me figure out how to do that?" Lisa Chen, who'd been hoping for exactly this kind of call, smiled. "Master Chief, it would be my honor." 6 weeks later, the Silent Warrior Foundation was officially registered as a 501c3 non-profit organization. The name came from Frank's philosophy that many veterans fought their hardest battles in silence, unseen and unheard. The foundation's mission was simple: to connect veterans struggling with PTSD, depression, or transition issues with peer mentors who'd survived similar struggles and come out the other side. The response was overwhelming. Within the first month, 200 veterans volunteered to be mentors. Within 2 months, 500 veterans reached out seeking help. Donations poured in. Corporate sponsors offered support. Military mental health professionals offered to volunteer their expertise. Frank found himself busier than he'd been since retiring from the SEALs, but it was a different kind of busy. Purposeful. Meaningful. Every day, he received messages from veterans who'd been connected with mentors, who'd found hope, who'd decided to keep fighting because someone had shown them they weren't alone. One message from a Navy corpsman named Jennifer, who'd served multiple tours in Iraq, brought tears to Frank's eyes. "Master Chief," she wrote, "3 months ago I had a plan to end my life. I'd written the note, I had the pills, I was ready. But I saw your story on the news, and something about how you talked about not being alone made me reach out to the Silent Warrior Foundation instead. They connected me with a mentor, a woman who'd been through what I'm going through and survived. And slowly, with her help, I'm finding reasons to stay. You saved my life without even knowing it. Thank you." Frank read that message 5 times, then saved it in a special folder on his phone. On days when he felt tired, when the weight of everything threatened to pull him down, he'd read messages like Jennifer's and remember why this work mattered. Meanwhile, the 3 young men from the gas station had completed their community service hours at the VA hospital and had moved on to new chapters in their lives. Devon had enrolled in a physical therapy program at the local community college. He'd discovered a passion for helping people recover from injuries, particularly veterans dealing with mobility issues. He'd told Frank in their last meeting, "I never knew what I wanted to do with my life until I met Carlos. Watching him push through pain, watching him refuse to be defined by his limitations, it inspired me. I want to help people like him." Chris had indeed begun studying to become a counselor. The stories he'd heard in the psychiatric ward had affected him deeply, and he'd realized that his own struggles, growing up in an unstable home, dealing with anger issues, feeling lost and purposeless, had given him empathy for others fighting similar battles. "Maybe my mess can become my message," he'd told Frank, echoing a phrase he'd heard in one of the group therapy sessions. Jamal had transformed his social media presence completely. His account, which once featured flashy cars and tough guy posturing, now focused on veteran advocacy, mental health awareness, and social justice issues. He'd partnered with the Silent Warrior Foundation to create content highlighting veteran stories. His follower count had actually increased, but more importantly, his engagement had become meaningful. People weren't just liking and scrolling, they were donating, volunteering, and spreading awareness. "You changed my life," Jamal had told Frank during a foundation event. "I was heading down a path that ended in prison or worse. You gave me a chance to become someone I'm proud of." "I didn't change your life," Frank corrected gently. "You changed your own life. I just gave you an opportunity. You're the one who did the work." As for Trey and Marcus, they'd been released from jail after serving 9 months with good behavior. Both had attended every class available during their incarceration: anger management, conflict resolution, addiction counseling. Both had written letters to Frank expressing genuine remorse and gratitude for his advocacy on their behalf. Trey's letter had been particularly moving. "Master Chief," he'd written, "I spent my whole life trying to be tough, trying to prove I was strong, trying to make people fear me, but you showed me that real strength looks nothing like what I thought. Real strength is quiet. It's controlled. It's merciful. You could have destroyed me that day. You could have made me another statistic, another young black man in prison with no future. Instead, you gave me a chance to learn, to grow, to become better. I don't know if I'll ever fully deserve that kindness, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to. Trey had gotten a job as a youth counselor at a community center, working with at-risk teenagers. He'd started a mentorship program focused on teaching young men about respect, responsibility, and the difference between performing toughness and embodying actual strength. He'd used his own story, the viral video, the arrest, the transformation, as a teaching tool. Marcus had reconnected with his family, completed a drug treatment program, and started working construction. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work, and Marcus had discovered that there was dignity in coming home tired from labor, knowing you'd built something with your hands. Both young men had reached out to Frank asking if they could volunteer with the Silent Warrior Foundation. Frank had accepted immediately. On a cool November evening, nearly a year after the gas station incident, Frank stood at a podium in a hotel ballroom in downtown San Diego. The Silent Warrior Foundation was hosting its first annual fundraising gala, and over 300 people had attended. Veterans, active duty military, politicians, celebrities, business leaders, and ordinary citizens who believed in the mission. Frank looked out at the crowd, feeling that familiar discomfort with being the center of attention, but also feeling something else. Gratitude, pride, hope. A year ago, Frank began, his voice amplified by the microphone, but still carrying that quiet authority. I was just trying to buy gas. I was just an old man going about my day, and 5 young men decided to make me their entertainment. They mocked me, they humiliated me, they threatened me, and in that moment I had a choice. I could respond with violence, I could crush them, and make no mistake I could have, or I could respond with something different, something harder than violence. I could respond with mercy. The room was absolutely silent. That choice, that moment of deciding to teach rather than punish, led to everything you see here today. This foundation, these connections, these lives changed and potentially saved. And I tell you that story not because I'm special. I'm not. I tell you that story because every single day, each of you faces similar choices. Maybe not as dramatic, maybe not captured on video, but choices nonetheless. Choices about how you treat the server who gets your order wrong, how you respond to the driver who cuts you off in traffic, how you react to the homeless veteran asking for spare change, how you engage with people who are different from you, who challenge you, who frustrate you. Frank paused, letting his words settle. We live in a time of incredible division. We've forgotten how to disagree without dehumanizing. We've forgotten how to see the humanity in people who are different from us. We've forgotten that every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. And that forgetting, that's what creates incidents like what happened at that gas station. That's what creates a society where veterans who gave everything are treated like they're nothing. That's what creates young men who think respect comes from fear rather than from character. He looked around the room, making eye contact with familiar faces. Devon was there, sitting with his physical therapy classmates. Chris was there with his counseling professors. Jamal was there, phone out, live streaming the event to his 200,000 followers. Trey and Marcus were at a table in the back, dressed in simple but clean clothes, their eyes fixed on Frank with reverence. The Silent Warrior Foundation exists because too many veterans are fighting their hardest battles alone. But this isn't just a veteran issue. This is a human issue. Because all of us at some point will face darkness. All of us will struggle. All of us will need someone to say, "You're not alone. I understand. Keep fighting." And if we can build a society where that support is freely given, where compassion is our first response instead of our last resort, where we judge people by their character rather than their appearance, well then maybe we'll have created something worth all the sacrifice that's come before. Frank's voice grew stronger, more passionate. So, I'm asking each of you, here tonight and watching online, to make a choice. Choose mercy over vengeance. Choose understanding over judgment. Choose connection over isolation. Choose to see the veteran sleeping on the street corner as a human being with a story, not as an eyesore to ignore. Choose to see the young person making mistakes as someone who can learn and grow, not as someone to write off. Choose to be the person who stands up when everyone else looks away. Choose to be the kind of strength that protects, that lifts up, that transforms. He stopped, his eyes growing slightly damp. Because that's what real warriors do. We don't fight to destroy, we fight to protect. We don't seek violence, we seek peace. We don't take lives unless absolutely necessary, and when we do, we carry that weight forever. But we also build, we mentor, we serve, and when our wars end, when our uniforms come off, that mission continues. The mission to make the world a little bit better than we found it. The mission to help those who can't help themselves. The mission to honor the fallen by living lives worthy of their sacrifice. Frank's voice dropped to just above a whisper, but in the silent room, everyone heard every word. A year ago, 5 young men saw a frail old man at a gas station and decided he was worthless. Today, those same 5 young men are volunteers at this foundation, dedicating their lives to serving others. That transformation didn't happen because of punishment. It happened because of possibility, because someone believed they could be better, and if they can change, if they can grow from their worst moment into something meaningful, then anyone can. Everyone can. All it takes is someone willing to believe in them, someone willing to show them a different path. Frank looked directly into the camera that was live streaming the event. So if you're watching this, if you're struggling, if you're lost, if you feel like you're fighting alone, you're not. We're here. Reach out. Ask for help. There is no shame in seeking support. There is no weakness in admitting you're broken. The only shame is suffering in silence when help is available. And if you're in a position to help, if you have strength to spare, if you've overcome your own battles, then reach back. Pull someone else up. Share your story. Be the mentor you wish you'd had. Be the hope you once needed. He stepped back from the podium, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then slowly, someone started clapping. Then another. Then everyone was on their feet, applauding, some crying, all of them moved by words that came not from a script, but from a lifetime of hard-won wisdom. Frank stood there, uncomfortable as always with the attention, but understanding that this moment wasn't about him. It was about something bigger. It was about all of them, collectively deciding to be better, to do better, to create a world where strength meant protection, where warriors could be vulnerable, where mercy was a superpower rather than a weakness. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Frank found himself standing outside the hotel, looking up at the stars. The same stars he'd navigated by during night operations, the same stars that had watched over battlefields and brought some comfort in the darkest moments, the same stars that no matter what chaos unfolded below remained constant and unchanging. Jerome Washington, the man who'd stood up at the gas station when no one else would, approached Frank with a smile. "Hell of a speech, Master Chief," Jerome said, shaking Frank's hand warmly. "Thank you for being there that day," Frank replied. "You didn't have to step in, you did anyway. That took courage." "Learned from the best," Jerome said with a grin. "Besides, I've been volunteering at the foundation. Seems like the least I could do." They stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 men from different generations, different backgrounds, united by a shared belief that doing the right thing mattered, even when it was hard. "You think we're making a difference?" Jerome asked quietly. "Really?" Frank thought about Jennifer, the Navy corpsman who'd chosen to live, about Daniel, the young Marine who was slowly healing, about Devon, Chris, Jamal, Trey, and Marcus, all of whom had transformed their lives, about the hundreds of veterans connected with mentors, the thousands reached by awareness campaigns, the ripples spreading outward in ways they'd never fully measure. "Yeah," Frank said with certainty. "Yeah, I think we are." As Frank drove home that night in his truck, the one given to him by a grateful car dealership owner whose son he'd indirectly saved. He felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of purpose. Not the end of battles, but the understanding that some fights are worth continuing forever. He thought about Tommy Reeves, the young SEAL who died in his arms 30 years ago. Thought about all the brothers and sisters who'd never made it home. Thought about the debt he owed them, the debt all survivors carry. "I'm still fighting, Tommy," Frank whispered to the empty truck. "Different battlefield, same mission. Protect those who need protecting. Never leave anyone behind. Make it mean something." And somewhere in whatever place fallen warriors go, maybe Tommy smiled, because Frank Delaney, Master Chief Petty Officer, decorated Navy SEAL, accidental advocate and reluctant hero, was still on the mission, still serving, still fighting the good fight. The war might have ended, but the warrior remained. And in a world that desperately needed more warriors like him, warriors who understood that true strength protects rather than destroys, that real courage faces darkness with compassion, that genuine honor demands we lift others up rather than tear them down. Frank Delaney had become exactly what he'd always been, a silent warrior, fighting battles most people never see, making sacrifices most people never acknowledge, and changing lives in ways that ripple outward, touching people he'll never meet, in places he'll never go for generations yet to come. This is more than just a story about an old man at a gas station. This is a story about all of us, about the choices we make every single day, about whether we respond to disrespect with more disrespect or whether we break the cycle, about whether we write people off or believe in their potential to change, about whether we're warriors who destroy or warriors who build. Frank Delaney's story reminds us that heroes don't always wear capes or uniforms. Sometimes they wear faded jeans and baseball caps. Sometimes they're the quiet person you pass without noticing. Sometimes they're the elderly veteran buying gas, the homeless man on the corner, the struggling teenager who just needs someone to believe in them. And each of us has the power to be that someone, to be the person who stands up when everyone else looks away, to be the voice that says, "You matter," when the world says, "You don't." To be the strength that lifts up rather than tears down. So here's my question for you. What will you do with that power? When you encounter someone different, someone struggling, someone who seems weak or worthless or broken, how will you respond? Will you be Trey from the beginning of this story, mocking and dismissing? Or will you be Trey from the end, transformed and committed to serving others? The choice is yours. And that choice, multiplied across millions of people making similar decisions every day, is what determines what kind of world we live in. Choose wisely. Choose compassionately. Choose to be the kind of strength that makes the world better. And if this story touched you, if it made you think, if it changed even slightly how you'll treat the next person you encounter, share it, not for likes or views, but because these lessons need to spread. Because respect is taught, because honor is learned, because warriors are made through choices, not just through battles. Never forget, real heroes don't always make the news, but they always make a difference. Fair winds and following seas to all who serve, who've served, and who support those who serve. You are not forgotten, you are not alone, and your fight, whatever it is, matters. Semper Fi, Huya, and thank you.